There's nothing quite like reliving the happiest day of your life, only to realize it's a horror story in disguise. Nostalgia's funny that way. It makes fools of us all. And in my case, it was less about being a fool and more about being the punchline to a cruel joke. It all started at a family gathering last month. My wife, Ava, and I were hosting her parents, siblings, and a few extended relatives for a casual get-together. The evening was filled with the usual noise. Children running around, adults gossiping over wine, and someone inevitably suggesting we watch old home videos for a laugh. One of Ava's cousins brought out a USB drive containing clips from our wedding. It was a charming but corny ceremony in a small lakeside chapel, complete with handwritten vows. Everyone oohed and ahed as they watched us exchange promises on the screen. I stood behind the couch, half smiling and half cringing at how young we looked. But as Ava's vows played, something about her words caught my attention. I'd heard them before, of course, but back then, I was blinded by love and the pressure of the moment. This time, though, they hit differently. She spoke about honoring the complexity of love and being patient when life pulls us in different directions. At the time, I thought she was being poetic. Now, I felt like she was speaking in code. I couldn't explain it, but her tone, her phrasing, it all sounded too specific, too deliberate. I dismissed the thought at first. Surely I was overthinking it. But as the night went on, the words kept replaying in my head. Why did they sound so much like a disclaimer? Like a warning I'd been too naive to catch? I spent the rest of the evening in a fog, forcing smiles and small talk while something deep inside me stirred. It wasn't quite suspicion yet, just an itch I couldn't scratch. When the guests finally left, I told myself I was just tired. But even as Ava fell asleep beside me, I stayed awake, replaying her vows in my head like a detective revisiting a crucial clue. I didn't know it then, but that night would mark the beginning of an unraveling I could never have imagined. The thing about doubts is that they have a way of growing like a crack in a windshield that slowly spreads until the entire glass shatters. By the time I woke up the next morning, Ava's vows weren't just a memory. They were an obsession. Every word felt like a breadcrumb, leading me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. I spent the day trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe I was projecting, or maybe I'd just grown cynical after years of marriage. But no matter how much I rationalized, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I'd missed. That afternoon, while Ava was out running errands, I decided to revisit the vows. I plugged in the USB drive and replayed the clip, this time with a critical ear. As I listened, I couldn't help but notice how carefully she'd chosen her words. Phrases like accepting the paths we take and cherishing the love we're capable of sharing stood out like neon signs. What paths? What love? And why did it sound like she was subtly excusing something? I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. Snooping wasn't my style, but my curiosity was rapidly outweighing my moral reservations. It wasn't until I stumbled upon an old box of keepsakes in the closet that I found my first clue. Inside the box were letters, cards, and small mementos from our early days together. Most of it was innocent: ticket stubs, love notes, and cheesy Polaroids. But tucked between the pages of an old notebook was a folded piece of paper that stopped me cold. It was a handwritten draft of Ava's wedding vows, complete with scribbled-out lines and revisions. As I read through it, my stomach churned. The final version had been polished, but the raw draft was different. Words like forgiveness and understanding appeared repeatedly, along with phrases about mistakes we can't undo and finding strength in imperfections. Mistakes? Imperfections? What was she talking about? The draft wasn't damning on its own, but it added fuel to the fire of my suspicions. Suddenly, those poetic vows didn't seem so romantic. They felt like a confession disguised as a promise. I put the paper back and closed the box, my mind racing. If there was something Ava wasn't telling me, I had to find out what it was. And so, against my better judgment, I made a decision. I would start looking for answers, no matter where they led. When you start digging for the truth, it's like opening a floodgate. What comes out isn't a slow trickle, but a torrent, overwhelming and unstoppable. That draft of Ava's vows had cracked open something inside me, a need to uncover what I'd been too blind, or too trusting to see. Every detail of our life together now felt like a potential clue, every memory tinged with suspicion. At first, I convinced myself I was just being thorough, not paranoid. I started with the little things, subtle actions she wouldn't notice. I scrolled through old photos, looking for anything that seemed off, a background, a detail, something that didn't match the story I thought I knew. I reread texts from years ago, trying to parse meaning from words I'd barely glanced at the first time. I even dug through her forgotten journals, stored in a box in the closet, hoping they might offer insight into what was really going on in her mind. It felt invasive, wrong, even, but I justified it by telling myself this wasn't about proving she was guilty. It was about proving she wasn't. I wanted to find nothing, to confirm that I was overreacting, that the unease I felt was just my imagination. For days, that's exactly what I found. Nothing. Just happy memories, mundane details, and a life that seemed, on the surface, perfectly ordinary. But as they say, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. My gut told me there was more, something deeper, and the longer I searched, the more that feeling grew. So I ventured into more dangerous territory, her digital life. It started with her emails, looking for receipts, itineraries, or messages that didn't add up. Then came her social media accounts, her cloud backups, her message apps. Ava wasn't careless. There were no explicit confessions or incriminating photos, but patterns began to emerge. The first clue was a weekend trip she'd taken 2 years ago, supposedly a girls' getaway with friends. At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it, but now in hindsight, the details didn't add up. She had no photos from the trip, no souvenirs, no stories to share. When I checked her emails from that weekend, I found a hotel reservation for 2 under her name. Then there was the dinner reservation. It showed up in an old email, a table for 2 at an upscale restaurant I'd never been to. The date? A night I'd been working late. I couldn't recall her mentioning dinner plans that evening, and when I cross-referenced it with her texts, there was nothing. No confirmation, no explanation. Each discovery felt like pulling on a thread in a tangled web, and the more I pulled, the larger the web grew. The most damning piece of evidence came from her cloud backup, a folder I didn't even know existed. Inside were photos I'd never seen before. At first glance, they seemed innocent enough. Selfies taken in unfamiliar places, snapshots of dinners and outings I wasn't part of. But it was the small details that stood out. The way she smiled in those photos, different, freer. The unfamiliar wine glasses and table settings that didn't match any restaurant we'd visited. And then there was him. In several of the photos, blurred but unmistakable, was a man. He was never the focus of the picture, always in the background or at the edge of the frame, but his presence was impossible to ignore. His face was unfamiliar, but the way Ava leaned toward him, the way they occupied the same space, it spoke volumes. I stared at those photos for what felt like hours, my mind racing with questions. Who was he? How long had this been going on? And why did she think she could hide it from me? By the time I closed the folder, my curiosity had transformed into something darker, a quiet, simmering rage. This wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It was about reclaiming control over a life that had been slipping through my fingers without me realizing it. Ava had made a choice to deceive me, and now I had to decide what to do with the knowledge I was uncovering. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed more definitive proof, something that would leave no room for doubt. The kind of evidence that wouldn't just answer my questions, but would make her lies impossible to deny. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I set up a plan, not just to catch her in the act, but to make sure that when I finally confronted her, I'd have the upper hand. The hardest part about setting a trap is pretending you're not doing it. Every instinct in me wanted to confront Ava right then and there, to throw those photos in her face and demand an explanation. But I knew better. The truth, once fully exposed, had to be undeniable, not just to me, but to her, and to anyone else who might hear about it later. I started with the simplest step, setting up a keylogger on her devices. It felt dirty, invasive, and downright paranoid, but I didn't care anymore. I told myself it wasn't about controlling her. It was about confirming what I already suspected. The results were slow to come in, but I waited patiently, reviewing every search, every keystroke, and every login like a hunter tracking footprints in the snow. Meanwhile, I began observing her more closely. Her habits, her routines, even the subtle shifts in her mood. She was good at hiding things, I'll give her that. She never seemed nervous or guilty, and her affection toward me never wavered. But there were cracks in her facade if you knew where to look. Like how she'd take her phone to the bathroom every time it buzzed, or how she'd linger a little too long before coming home from yoga. I needed something tangible, something indisputable. That's when I came up with the idea of using her own tendencies against her. Ava was meticulous about planning. She loved schedules, reminders, and sync calendars. So I did the one thing she never expected. I created a fake event. Using her email account, I set up a dinner reservation for two at a restaurant we'd never been to. I made sure it was for a night. I'd told her I'd be working late, then waited to see what she'd do. Sure enough, 2 days later, I saw her message the same man from the photos. The message was short, just a confirmation of the time and place, but it was all I needed. Now I had her cornered, but I wasn't ready to strike just yet. Instead, I booked a table at the same restaurant for myself, an hour before their reservation. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, to take the truth out of the shadows and put it under a glaring spotlight. The night of the dinner, I left the house early, telling Ava I had an important meeting. She kissed me goodbye like everything was normal, and for a moment I almost believed it. Almost. I arrived at the restaurant and took a seat where I could see the entrance clearly. My heart was pounding as I watched the minutes tick by, each one stretching longer than the last. And then, right on time, she walked in. She wasn't alone. Watching Ava walk in with another man was like seeing a stranger wearing her skin. The familiarity of her laugh, the way she brushed her hair behind her ear, those were things I used to adore. But now, they were weapons, slicing through every good memory we'd ever shared. She looked radiant, dressed in a way that was casual but carefully calculated. And him? He had that smug confidence of someone who thought he'd won a prize he didn't deserve. I let them settle in, ordering wine and appetizers, laughing like they were the only two people in the world. Meanwhile, I sat in the shadows, recording everything. My phone captured it all. The way their hands brushed across the table, the intimate way she leaned into him when he spoke. It was all the proof I needed, but I wasn't stopping there. Revenge wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about making her feel the weight of her betrayal. Ava loved control. Her life, a carefully curated narrative of perfection. So I decided to tear that narrative apart, piece by piece. I walked up to their table, my footsteps deliberate, my presence impossible to ignore. Her laugh froze in her throat when she saw me, her face draining of color. The man, Daniel, as I later learned, looked up with confusion, probably trying to place who I was. I didn't say a word. I set my phone on the table, playing back the video I just recorded. The audio was crisp, her laughter mingling with his, a soundtrack of their infidelity. The restaurant seemed to shrink around us, the buzz of conversation fading as other diners noticed the unfolding drama. Ava's hand shot out to stop the video, but I snatched the phone away before she could. "Don't worry," I said, finally breaking the silence. "I've already shared it with a few people who'd find it interesting." Her eyes widened, panic setting in as she realized what I meant. I turned to Daniel, who now looked less smug and more like a man who'd just realized he was in way over his head. "You must be Daniel," I said, extending my hand mockingly. "The wife stealer. Nice to finally meet you." He didn't take the bait, too stunned to respond. Ava, meanwhile, was fumbling for words, stammering out half-formed excuses that I ignored entirely. I wasn't here to listen to her lies. I was here to deliver justice. Without another word, I pulled out a thick envelope from my jacket and set it on the table. Inside were printed screenshots of her texts, the photos I'd found, and a copy of the video I'd just taken. "Consider this my resignation," I said. "From this marriage, from your lies, from everything." Before she could respond, I walked out, leaving her and Daniel to stew in their public humiliation. But my revenge didn't stop there. Back home, I finished the second phase of my plan. The email I'd scheduled to send while I was at the restaurant had already gone out. It contained everything: photos, messages, and a detailed account of her affair, sent to her parents, siblings, close friends, and a few of her colleagues. I'd even included Daniel's wife on the list. Yes, he had a wife. By the time I'd settled into my hotel room that night, the fallout had already begun. My phone buzzed with messages, some angry, some supportive, all shocked. Ava's carefully constructed world was unraveling in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As for Daniel, his wife called me the next day, thanking me for the evidence and assuring me that divorce papers were already in motion. Turns out, he'd been juggling lies of his own, and my actions had inadvertently freed her from a marriage built on deceit. In the end, revenge wasn't about making Ava suffer. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my life, and my future. And as I sat in that hotel room, finally free of her lies, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. When the dust settled, the silence was deafening. For the first time in years, I had no messages from Ava begging for forgiveness, no pretenses to maintain, no lies to untangle. But the quiet didn't bring peace, not immediately. Instead, it felt like standing in the rubble of a life I didn't recognize, staring at the remains of a foundation that had crumbled without warning. The storm I unleashed had wrecked more than just her world. Friends were picking sides, family members were stunned into silence, and even my own sense of identity felt fractured. Was I a victim or a villain? Could I have handled it differently? Did exposing her so publicly make me as cruel as she had been? These questions haunted me as much as her betrayal did. Ava tried to salvage what little she could of her reputation, but the damage was irreparable. Her parents, deeply religious and fiercely protective of their family image, couldn't comprehend how their perfect daughter could have orchestrated such deceit. Her mother left me teary voicemails, begging me to reconsider airing our dirty laundry. Her father, ever the stoic, sent a single message: she's no longer welcome in our home. That one hurt, even for me. Daniel's fallout was equally catastrophic. His wife, armed with both my evidence and her own discoveries, left no stone unturned. She filed for divorce within days, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. His professional life took a hit as well. Apparently, corporate executives don't look kindly on employees whose personal scandals tarnish the company image. But amidst the chaos, I started to see the outlines of something I hadn't felt in years: clarity. Ava's betrayal wasn't just a moment of infidelity. It was a mirror held up to a marriage that had been eroding long before she met Daniel. I realized how much of myself I'd given away over the years, compromising my dreams, my boundaries, my happiness, all in the name of keeping us together. Rebuilding wasn't easy. For weeks, I woke up in the sterile bed of a hotel room, staring at the ceiling and wondering where to start. Therapy was my first step. I'd always scoffed at the idea, thinking it was for people who couldn't handle their own problems. But sitting across from a stranger who listened without judgment, who guided me through the mess of emotions I couldn't untangle alone, it was like learning to breathe again after years of suffocation. I started small, focusing on routines. Morning runs turned into gym sessions. Lonely nights became opportunities to reconnect with old friends, to laugh and reminisce and remember who I was before all this. I poured myself into work, not as an escape, but as a way to rebuild my confidence. Each project completed felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was still capable, still whole. One day, I returned to the house to finalize the sale. Ava had moved out weeks ago, leaving behind a few stray boxes and a silence that felt almost reverent. As I walked through the empty rooms, memories flooded back, some sweet, others bitter, all of them tinged with the weight of what we'd lost. In the living room, I found one of her forgotten journals tucked under the couch. Flipping through it, I discovered pages filled with reflections, some about us, some about her own struggles. One line stood out, scrawled in the margins of a half-finished entry: "I'm scared of who I've become." For the first time, I felt something other than anger toward her. It wasn't forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that. But an understanding that her betrayal wasn't just a failing of our marriage. It was a reflection of her own fractured self, her own inability to face the cracks in her identity. Selling the house felt like shedding old skin. The keys exchanged hands, the paperwork was signed, and with it went the last tangible connection to a life I no longer wanted. I used the money to start over in a new city, a place where nobody knew my name, where I could rebuild without the weight of judgment or pity. The new apartment was small but bright, with sunlight streaming through the windows each morning. I filled it with things that felt like me, artwork I loved, books I'd always meant to read, furniture that didn't come with compromises. For the first time in years, my space felt like mine, not ours. The scars are still there, and some days are harder than others. But they're healing. Each step forward feels a little lighter, a little freer. I've learned to sit with my pain without letting it define me, to acknowledge the betrayal without letting it overshadow the parts of myself that remain whole. Ava reached out once, months later, with a letter that arrived unannounced in my mailbox. She wrote about regret, about lessons learned, about the pain of losing everything. I didn't respond. Some doors are better left closed. And now, as I write this, I feel something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. Hope that life goes on, that wounds heal, that even in the face of betrayal, there's room to grow. The man I am today isn't the same man I was before. He's stronger, wiser, and finally free. And that, I think, is the best revenge of all.